Daniel Feller. He is here to speak on the presidential election of 1824. Mr. Feller is a professor of history and editor-director of the papers of Andrew Jackson at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. He is the author of The Public Lands in Jacksonian Politics and The Jacksonian Promise, America 1815 to 1840, along with many articles, chapters, and essays. He has contributed to standard reference works including the Oxford Companion to the United States History, the Dictionary of American History, and Arthur M. Swallow Jr.'s Running for President, the Candidates and Their Images. In December 2007, the University of Tennessee Press published the Papers of Andrew Jackson, Volume 7, 1829, which Feller is editor. This is the first of 8 presidential volumes in the series. This past January, a 2-hour documentary, Andrew Jackson, Good, Evil, and the Presidency, aired nationally on PBS. Feller served as the senior academic advisor to the film and a leading on-camera presence. Feller also recently contributed to a multi-authored book titled Congress and the Emergence of Sectionalism, to which Feller contributed a chapter entitled Andrew Jackson versus the Senate.
Thank you. And before I say anything else, I want to say how grateful I was for the invitation and how honored and happy I am to be here in such distinguished company. And we're all having a wonderful time. At the same time, I have to say that unlike Al Gore, I stand before you as a kept man. When Brian originally approached me about this, he said, how would you like to talk on 1824 as one of the most important elections? He didn't say, do you think 1824 is one of the most important elections? He said, how would you like to talk about it as one of the most important elections? It's a kind of counterintuitive choice in the sense that the Jacksonian election that usually gets the most attention is not 1824 but 1828. In 1828, in a famous campaign full of sexual slander and ballyhoo, Andrew Jackson defeated the incumbent John Quincy Adams and went on to serve 2 terms and found the Democratic Party. There have been lots of books written about the 1828 election. The 1824 election gets a lot less attention, partly because it's a lot harder to understand. Nonetheless, I'm a cheap date and I will do anything. Good company and free food, as good as those would have plenty of both. And as I started to write the talk, I warmed to the task. And so I am here to tell you, not as the result of a corrupt bargain, but out of heartfelt conviction, that, and I will not only tell you, but prove to you beyond a shadow of doubt, that 1824 was not only the most important election ever, that goes almost without saying, but in fact the most consequential event in the history of the modern world. So there. Why is 1824 memorable? Well, several reasons. It was the second, Roger Sharp told us about first, 1800, it was the second, and so far the last, and we'll see why, election to be decided in the House of Representatives. It was one of only a few, 3 or 4, where the guy who led in the popular vote didn't win the election, and is the only one where the guy who led in the electoral vote, who got more electoral votes than anybody else, didn't win the election. And it set the stage for that famous face-off in 1828 between Jackson and Adams. But beyond all this, it furnished the classic, template-defining tale of an election stolen out from the people by Washington intrigue, bargain, and corruption. Well, in the standard tale, what I'm going to do is tell the standard tale as it's often told, briefly in present tense, and then like the pointy-headed academic that I am, I'm going to go back and pick it apart in past tense, the way it actually happened. So let's start with the kind of iconic version of this. The plot and the lead characters in this are right out of central casting. Hollywood couldn't do it any better. On one side stands the arch New England Puritan, John Quincy Adams, described as, and I'm quoting, reserved, cold, austere, and forbidding. The hook on this quote is that that's the way Adams described himself in his own diary. He was brilliant but aloof, a Republican aristocrat, a Federalist in manners, if not any more formally in politics, like his dad, old John Adams. That's on one side. On the other is the wild child of the frontier, the untutored man of the people, Major General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, Old Hickory, Democratic champion, hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And in between the two stands the crafty, slippery, silver-tongued Politico, the insider's insider, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay of Kentucky. In the general election, so the well-known story goes, the popular Jackson beats Adams handily, but he doesn't get a majority in the Electoral College, for reasons that usually aren't mentioned. We'll get back to that. He doesn't get a majority in the Electoral College, and therefore, as decreed by the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, the election goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, the state delegations each cast one vote. They vote by states, not by individuals. And there are 24 states, and every single one of them, each one from New York, which has 34 congressmen, down to Delaware, which has just one, each gets one vote in the House. There are 24 states. It takes a majority of state delegations to win. That's 13. And the man who's going to preside over this process is, of course, that Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay. Well, within the Capitol, as the election comes closer, intrigue and rumor run riot. On January 9th, 1825, about a month before the House is going to vote, Adams and Clay have a private meeting. Story soon appears in the papers accusing them of making a bargain. Clay will make Adams president, Adams will make Clay Secretary of State. And given that the Secretary of Stateship had been the stepping stone to the presidency for some time past, basically it's, I'll make you president now, you'll make me president next. Story hits the papers. Clay publishes a retort in the papers calling it a barefaced lie and offering to shoot anybody who would own up to being the author of this story. Nonetheless, Clay also publicly comes out for Adams and makes no bones of the fact that he's going to use all his influence to make Adams president, even though back home in Kentucky, the state legislature of Kentucky has instructed Clay and the other Kentucky congressmen to vote for Jackson. Well, in the end, the vote is agonizingly close. In one famous version of the tale, the one told by Martin Van Buren in his autobiography, it comes down to a single deadlocked state, namely Van Buren's own New York, and a single congressman, the kindly but befuddled Stephen Van Rensselaer, known as the Old Patroon. Now, as Van Buren tells the story, Van Rensselaer is pledged, he's promised that he's not going to vote for Adams. But in the lobby, just before the vote, as he's going in, he's waylaid by Henry Clay and by Senator Daniel Webster, a congressman at that time. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and they go to work on Van Rensselaer, and by the time he comes into the House, he's pretty worked over. Sorely troubled, he bows his head to seek divine guidance, sees a piece of paper on the floor with the word Adams on it, takes this as a sign from God, votes for Adams, and that swings New York, giving Adams exactly the 13 states he needs to win. And as Van Buren says, in this way it was that Mr. Adams was made president. Promptly, Adams does indeed offer the Department of State to Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson goes ballistic. So you see that Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver, Jackson explodes. This is an actual quote. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? And immediately Jackson's followers, taking cue from him, join in. A Jackson paper in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Observer, runs a long headline that says, "Expired at Washington. On the 9th of February, 1825. The virtue, liberty, and independence of the United States, caused by poison administered by the assassin hand of John Quincy Adams, the usurper, and Henry Clay." Adams takes the inaugural oath on March 4th, which is when they did it in those days, with cries of corrupt bargain, rising all around him. His administration is doomed before it starts. For the next 4 years, a popular tide of outrage against the aristocratic coalition of Adams and Clay, and of enthusiasm for the people's man Andrew Jackson mounts inexorably. In 1828, it floods, sweeping Jackson into the White House and Adams and Clay into political oblivion. Well, thus goes the tale. It's a classic story with a classic moral. Heed the people and beware of politicians. Virtue resides in the voters, and corruption breeds in Washington. As we're about to see, this iconic version of the story, while not entirely exactly false, is also not entirely exactly true. But this is the version that was repeated over and over and over again, starting with Jackson and his own followers, and they believed it to be true. And their endless retelling of it enshrined it with a political truth, even a kind of political sanctity of its own. For the rest of his very long and distinguished career, Henry Clay had to answer for a corrupt bargain that he swore to his death he had never made. John Quincy Adams' presidency could never erase the stain of its tainted origins, and Andrew Jackson, the victim of this alleged bargain, would ever bear the mantle of not only the people's hero, but the people's martyr, and in the end of their triumphant vindicator. Jackson would, of course, go on again to stomp Adams in 1828, serve 2 terms as president, and found the Democratic Party, with Henry Clay eventually leading the opposition party called the Whigs. Well, this legend of 1824 has exercised a portentous influence on American politics ever since. And that legend, I think, is why Americans to this day look at the idea of an election by the House of Representatives with something close to horror. And that horror, in turn, has explained why that event has never been allowed to happen. When there's a contested election like 1876, they will do anything other than let that election go to the House of Representatives. Even in the nomination process, the thought of a candidate selected by a brokered convention or the proverbial smoke-filled room has become odious. This legend has not only, its influence has not only remained but has grown and expanded. So now the idea even that you get nominated without the popular vote behind you is a kind of stain. Speaking of which, I just the other day read an article in Newsweek suggesting that the Obama campaign is kind of a fraud because he would have been toast if he hadn't have won the Iowa caucuses. And how did he win the Iowa caucuses? Did they have a vote in Iowa where everybody went to the polls? No, they have these weird caucuses where first you have to show up and then you have to move around the room. And the reason why he won the Iowa caucuses is because his people rigged the caucuses. They were insiders. They knew how the system worked. Defying the will of the people. I can't remember whether Hillary Clinton or John McCain wrote this piece, but anyway, so there you have it. And we have heard talk about which candidate on the Democratic side has in fact won the most popular votes, even in the primary. Well, so this admonition stands ever fresh. Never foil the people's will, beware the fate of Adams and Clay. And yet, in this case, as in many others, the lesson of history may be a good lesson, but it makes for pretty bad history. The legend has become so powerful that it overrides the facts. And in fact, and I had written this before listening to yesterday's talk, but you've already heard this now several times. What happened in 1824 looked very different if you go back to the beginning and play it forward than if you look back at it from now. This election looked very different in prospect than in retrospect. So now what I'm going to do is go back and tell the story over as participants experienced it, starting not as I just did from the end, the final act, but from the beginning. The campaign of 1824, which actually went on for years before 1824. If you think presidential campaigns are long now, you ain't seen nothing like 24. The campaign took shape in a remarkably disorganized political environment. The Federalist Party, which had furnished the first 2 presidents and then had been a credible opposition down through 1812, had kind of blown away after the Federalists had predicted disaster from the War of 1812, and some of them did what they could to make sure the War of 1812 would be a disaster, and it ended more or less well anyway, leaving the Federalists looking like stab-in-the-back traitors. That left the other party, the Democratic-Republican Party, and as you probably know, that's neither today's Democratic Party nor today's Republican Party. It's Thomas Jefferson's party, and following Roger Sharpe, from now on, I'm just going to call it the Republican Party. That left the Republican Party, after the War of 1812, as the only game in town. The Federalists carried only 3 states against James Monroe in 1816. In 1820, they gave up altogether. Monroe won re-election to a second term without opposition and with all but one of the electoral votes. Monroe was the 2-term successor to James Madison, the 2-term successor to Thomas Jefferson, all of them of the Democratic-Republican Party. Well, who's going to come next? About 30 names were put forth at one time or another, but by 1823 it had narrowed down to about 5 candidates, not about 5. First, General Jackson, who's already been introduced to you. Second, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State under Monroe. Third, General Andrew Jackson, and then 2 others from Monroe's cabinet. Secretary of the Treasury, William Harris Crawford of Georgia, who nobody remembers today, but who you're going to hear a lot about. And Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Now, the National Party Convention hadn't been invented yet, so names were put forth in other ways. Jackson, for instance, was nominated by a caucus of Tennessee state legislators. In keeping with a powerful precedent set by George Washington and not broken until much later, the candidates themselves did nothing to overtly promote themselves. The feeling was that if you looked like you wanted the presidency too much, you were probably a dangerous man. And so they all put on this show of being willing to serve, if called upon, to make the sacrifice, but not being eager. They did not go out and overtly campaign, any of them. They did find ways to let their availability be known, and we'll see some of this later, to let their policy positions insofar as they wanted them to be known. Well, so that all these guys are members of the same, ostensibly at least, of the same Democratic-Republican Party, because that's the only party there is. In another way also, the political system was in flux. The idea of democracy, the notion that the people should determine how a state cast its presidential votes, was quickly catching on. As I hope you all know, the Constitution does not, to this day, provide for a popular vote for president. The legislature of Vermont could, if they wanted to, tomorrow abolish the popular vote for president in this state. It's not likely they're going to do it. The Constitution says that the method of choosing presidential electors, who in turn cast the electoral votes, shall be determined by the state legislature. And at first, most state legislatures had simply elected the electors themselves. But the tide had been turning since the War of 1812 toward a popular vote for president. By 1824, that tide had engulfed 18 of 24 states. And that made 1824 the first election where you have some semblance of a national plebiscite, where there are enough states that have a popular vote that you can add them all together and talk about a national popular vote. By 1832, every state would have a popular vote for president, except South Carolina, which didn't have it until after the Civil War. Still, in 1824, 6 states didn't have a popular vote for president. Those 6 were Vermont, New York, the biggest state in the Union, Delaware, South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana. The other 18 did have a popular vote. Even if there was a popular vote, there was, in many states, not much contest. And the reason is that each of these 5 candidates, or 4 of the 5 anyway, stood on a strong regional base. Despite the fact that he had deserted his father's Federalist Party and gone over to the Democratic-Republican dark side some years before, John Quincy Adams was still the favorite son of New England. This is one time when Vermont and New Hampshire agreed politically. They haven't since, apparently. Treasury Secretary Crawford, who was born in Virginia, was the closest thing to an apparent successor to the Virginia line of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Unlike Adams, he had been a Democratic-Republican from the very beginning, and in fact, he had been Monroe's rival for the party's nomination in 1816, so you could argue that it was his turn. Crawford's home territory was his native Virginia, his adopted state of Georgia, and North Carolina, the southeastern coast. Out in the west, we had Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson, the first 2 candidates to run for the presidency from the Trans-Appalachian West. Clay's bailiwick was the Ohio Valley region, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and also Kentucky and Missouri. Jackson's home base was in the New Southwest, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. The only candidate without a regional base beyond his home state was Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun, forget everything you know about John C. Calhoun. Much later did Calhoun become the defiant sectionalist who we all remember. At this time, Calhoun was in fact a nationalist, and he hoped to attract a national and especially a northern following. But when his candidacy fizzled in Pennsylvania in March 1824, he withdrew, and that left 4 candidates. When Calhoun withdrew, he accepted the vice presidential spot on the Adams and Jackson tickets. Now, the circumstances of Calhoun's withdrawal should tell us 2 things about the 1824 campaign. First, it was going to be fought out along the midsection of the country, including Pennsylvania. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, west through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri. Those, as we shall see, are the states that are going to decide the election. Second, and this is worth stressing, there was nothing implausible, despite that chuckle you all gave, in Jackson running as vice presidential candidate with both Calhoun running with both Jackson and Adams, for Jackson and Adams were not the principal antagonists in this campaign. In fact, they and Calhoun with them were principal allies. The real insider candidate and the early frontrunner, the man whom Adams, Jackson, and Calhoun were all challenging until Calhoun withdrew, was somebody, again, who's been nearly forgotten in later retellings, and that's William Harris Crawford. You shall not be distracted. We'll come back to that. Former Presidents Jefferson and Madison were for Crawford. The editors of the quasi-official organ of the federal government of the Democratic Republican Party, the Washington National Intelligencer, they were for Crawford. And Crawford also had the party apparatus in Congress behind him, and for all intents and purposes, that party apparatus was the party itself. After the fiasco in 1800, when, as you saw yesterday, Federalist congressmen got to decide which Democratic Republican they'd rather have for president, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr, the Democratic Republican leaders had recognized that they needed some way to concentrate all of the party's strength upon one candidate. You can't have, if you have 2 or 3 guys running on the Democratic Republican Party ticket, then the Federalists, the minority, the aristocratic minority, can play divide and conquer. What they had hit upon after 1800 was a caucus of congressmen to nominate the candidate of the party. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Congressmen were elected from throughout the country. They offered a fair sampling of constituent opinion from throughout the country, and they were all gathered together conveniently in Washington anyway. So why not just happen to get together someday and decide who's going to be our party candidate in the next election? It was exactly such a caucus that had settled upon Madison to follow Jefferson in 1808. It was exactly such a caucus that had settled upon Monroe to follow Madison in 1860. But by 1824, things looked different. The collapse of federalism had thrown the Congressional Caucus into a new light. The idea of it is you need to have some means to remember that the National Nominating Convention that we have today was still off in the future. Nobody thought of that yet. You have to have the caucus in order to unite the party against the enemy, against the Federalist enemy. But by 1824, there is no Federalist enemy, at least none numerous and organized enough to worry about. And if the Congressional Caucus, therefore, is to go on choosing the Republican nominee, and if nomination is going to be tantamount to election, which it had been for Monroe and looked like it was going to be again, then the people are shut out of the process altogether. That basically they get told by a caucus congressman who the next president's going to be. They have no choice in the matter whatsoever. Accordingly, realizing that his men controlled the caucus, all of Crawford's rivals denounced the Congressional Caucus as an insider's device to rig the election. Now, Crawford's candidacy suffered a happenstance blow in the fall of 1823 when he suffered a paralytic stroke that left him semi-incapacitated, something his friends tried hard to conceal. They forged ahead and held the caucus anyway. On February 14, 1824, a congressional caucus was held. 68 members of Congress attended. 64 of them voted for Crawford to be the party's nominee for Congress. For president. According to established precedent, not president, that should have been the end of the campaign. Instead, it was the end of the caucus. For more important than the 64 congressmen and senators who voted for Crawford were the fact that nearly 3 times that number, 193, didn't go to the caucus. They conspicuously boycotted it. So Crawford is nominated by the caucus, but it's a rump caucus. It only has about 1/4 of the members of Congress attend. And the caucus was branded as undemocratic, as an elitist attempt to preempt the people's choice. The caucus sank into disrepute, and Crawford's candidacy sank along with it. Now, there is another dimension. I said all the other candidates attacked the caucus. There's another dimension that ganged up against Crawford. All of the 5 main candidates, or 4 after Calhoun withdrawals, were of the same political party, James Monroe's Democratic-Republican Party. 3 of them were in his cabinet. And the 4th, Andrew Jackson, had been a major general under Monroe and the administration's go-to guy whenever they wanted an illegal invasion of foreign territory. Monroe's administration was quite famous then and since for its absence of party strife. And indeed, Monroe's administration is also, following a contemporary newspaper, called the era of good feelings. Yet there had been, in fact, some nasty controversies under Monroe. They were not partisan, they were only vaguely ideological. They were disconnected flare-ups, producing momentary factional alignments rather than standing coalitions. Still, there's one pattern that threaded through all of them. There were, within Monroe's own political party and within his administration, people who were trying to uphold that administration, people who figured that they would profit by its success, and there were others trying to embarrass it who figured that their best way to gain was by its failure. Well, Adams, Jackson, and Calhoun had all banked on the success of the administration. Crawford and Clay were banking on its failure. Now, the most likely beneficiary of a successful, popular Monroe presidency would be John Quincy Adams. But in fact, whenever the administration was attacked, he, Jackson, and Calhoun all stood together. For instance, in 1818, Jackson, then a major general, launched an unauthorized military invasion, took the army with him, of Spanish Florida. When the cabinet heard about this, at first, the only person there who didn't want to repudiate and disown Jackson was Adams. Adams was trying to get Spain to cede Florida diplomatically, and Adams thought a nice little demonstration that we can conquer it whenever we want to is just the thing we need to move Spain off the dime. Calhoun and Monroe at first wanted to disown and repudiate Jackson. But Adams talked them around. But then, after the administration decided it would stand by Jackson, when a move developed in Congress to censure Jackson, Adams and Calhoun and Monroe all closed ranks because they understood correctly that the attack in Congress on Jackson was really an attack on the administration, an attack on Monroe himself. Who led that attack in Congress? Henry Clay and the supporters of William Crawford. Now, Crawford was in an odd position here. He was sitting in Monroe's cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury while his friends in Congress were doing their very best to wreck the administration. Adams and Calhoun and Monroe himself came over time to view Crawford as something of a spy and a saboteur. And there's a famous anecdote of a face-off between Crawford and Monroe. One of them was holding a pair of fire tongs and called the other a damn old scoundrel. Jackson was outside the cabinet, but Jackson had hated, remember this, hated Crawford, had hated him for years. So the most obvious pairings in 1824 didn't pit Adams against Jackson. They pitted Adams, Jackson, and Calhoun, as vice president on both tickets, together against Clay and Crawford. There was, in fact, much talk during the long campaign of alliances and coalitions, not of corrupt bargains, but of necessary ones, because with so many candidates, some kind of combination was going to have to be necessary or nobody was going to get elected. In fact, early on, the Adams people made overtures to Jackson. Would you like to be vice president on our ticket? This was before the Calhoun thing. Jackson refused, and with good reason. His appeal was stronger than his rivals realized. Still, in some states, Adams and Jackson men joined together, explicitly joined forces to field joint tickets that they called people's tickets. Well, one last division among the candidates figured only obliquely in the campaign, but perhaps did more than anything else to determine its results. That's the position on leading questions of political economy. Political economy is rather out of fashion now, but it was not then. In Congress, ever since the War of 1812, the leading continuing issue, as opposed to those momentary flare-ups, have been whether and how the federal government should help promote national economic integration and development. Two main instruments that appeared for doing this. One, a so-called protective tariff, that is a discriminatory tax on imported goods, usually British manufactured goods, to help American fledgling industrialists get started. The other, federal spending and federal sponsorship of roads and canals, a policy known for short as internal improvements. Now, Jeffersonian Republicans had traditionally opposed both policies, especially internal improvements, but that opposition had melted away under Monroe. Instead, voting in Congress on both of these issues, leading up to 1824, broke down very strictly along sectional lines, reflecting which parts of the country expected to gain from this program and which parts expected to wind up paying for it. To understand these, put away the later image of Yankee industrialists against Western and Southern farmers. At this time, in the early 1820s, New England's chief traditional livelihood was not textile mills, it was shipping. And New England merchants, along with Southern planters, generally opposed a protective tariff, and generally internal improvements as well. The core support for both of those policies lay instead, not in New England, but in that middle block of states that I mentioned earlier, running from Maryland and Pennsylvania westward through Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. And these battles were fought out in Congress, not the cabinet, and with the de facto ban on active campaigning that I talked about, if a candidate didn't want to say anything about him, he didn't have to. The bold exception was Speaker of the House Henry Clay. In speeches before the House in 1824, just before the election, Clay linked the two policies together. The protective tariff would not only protect American manufacturers from foreign competition, but it would also bring in revenue, which could then be used to spend for roads and canals. Clay announced this as a grand, integrated program of national betterment, and he gave it the famous name, the American System. Clay, in fact, alone among the candidates, predicated his presidential hopes nakedly on policy grounds, on the premise that there was a national, or at least a congressional, majority in favor of the American system, and that if he could link his candidacy to it, he would win. And the first part of that calculation at least seemed correct. In Congress in 1824, with Clay urging it on, Congress raised the tariff and embarked on an internal improvement plan, passing a precedent-setting bill. Well, also supporting both policies, and now in the Senate, and voting on them, was Andrew Jackson. He had resigned his major generalship, and then he was governor of Florida Territory for a little while. In 1823, the Tennessee legislature sent Jackson to the Senate to furnish his credentials. Jackson, like Clay, was a Westerner and a nationalist. And for him, as for Clay and most other Westerners, the economic nationalism of the American system was pretty much the same thing as patriotism. Jackson not only voted in 1824 for the tariff, he backed his vote with a lurid letter making the home market argument with a vengeance. Jackson said, I'm quoting this, "There's too much labor employed in agriculture." How's that? Too much labor employed in agriculture. And he went on to say that it would be good policy if we could somehow, and now I am quoting again, take from agriculture 600,000 men, women, and children and put them to work in factories. This is one of those cases where history gets rewritten. Later on, after Jackson turned against the tariff, Jackson's supporters found this letter so toxic that they tried to read it out of the record, and they've done a pretty good job of it. In Thomas Hart Benton's 30 Years View, which a lot of historians rely on as a kind of compendium of this period, they print the whole, Benton prints the whole letter in which Jackson supports the tariff and internal improvements, except this paragraph, and Ben just leaves it out. And he gives the impression that he's printing the whole letter, and he's not. Well, what did Crawford and Adams think of the American system? Nobody knew for sure. Their positions in the cabinet didn't require them to say. But if you judged by the way their home regions were voting in Congress, they were both likely to be against it. Well, the storybook legend of 1824, we're finally to the election itself, has a popular tide of enthusiasm for Jackson rising in the hinterlands and sweeping everything before it. That's about half true. The best returns we have, and I will come back to that phrase, the best returns we have show Jackson with about 42%. I'm not even sure whether the numbers that I'm giving you here are the same there, because there is no one authoritative set of returns. Show Jackson with about 42% of the popular vote, Adams with about 32%, Crawford and Clay with about 12% each. These numbers are dubious for all sorts of reasons. They only include votes for candidates in states where they had an electoral ticket. Not all 4 candidates had a ticket of electors running in every state. So, for instance, Jackson and Clay had no tickets in New England. So according to the popular vote totals, Jackson and Clay both got 0 votes in New England. Now, there's no doubt Adams would have carried these states, but probably one person in Vermont would have voted for Andrew Jackson. They also they count 0 for Adams in North Carolina for the same reason. And Adams wasn't going to carry North Carolina, but he did have some support there. They count 0 for Crawford in several western states, and of course they count 0 for everybody in New York, which is the nation's largest state, because there wasn't any popular vote there. The legislature cast New York's votes, and it split them up. Adams got 26, and the other 3 candidates got a few altogether, 12 in the other. Another thing about the vote total is that historians always ask not only who won, but how many people bothered to go to the polls, and the answer in 1824 is very few. Turnout was low. Only 27% of the eligible voters actually voted. In Pennsylvania, the most heavily contested state where there were 4 candidates in the field, and the most pivotal state, the turnout was under 20%. 4 out of 5 people didn't even vote. It's also clear that Jackson's popularity did not override regional preferences. As you can see, Adams carried all 6 New England states. Crawford carried Virginia and Georgia, as expected. Clay, as expected, carried Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri. Still, having said that, it's undeniable that Jackson was the only candidate with a popularity that went beyond his own region. He carried Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, as everybody expected. But he also beat Crawford in North Carolina. He beat Adams and Clay in Indiana and Illinois. He nearly carried Ohio against Clay, and Clay thought that Indiana and Illinois were his home ground. Jackson won New Jersey, and most astonishingly, in Pennsylvania, the nation's 2nd largest state, he not only won it, he won it by a 3-to-1 margin over all the other candidates combined. In the Electoral College, came out Jackson first with 99, 38% of the total, Adams second with 84. Now, Clay, I don't know whether this table shows this, Clay actually got a few more popular votes than Crawford, but it doesn't matter. According to the Constitution, 12th Amendment, the House of Representatives has to choose from among the top 3. Crawford got a few more electoral votes than Clay, therefore Clay ran 4th, and he's out of the running. House of Representatives now has to choose not between Adams and Jackson, but between Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. Clay could no longer be king, but he could still play kingmaker. And that brings us back to that myth-enshrouded moment in the tale of a backroom deal between Adams and Clay that swung the election and set the course of history ever after. How true was Jackson's charge of bargain and corruption? Well, part of it was clearly true, and indeed Clay never attempted to conceal it. He supported Adams in the House, and his influence helped Adams win the election. Remember, it takes 13 states in the House of Representatives, 13 congressional delegations out of a total of 24. In the Electoral College, in the general vote that you see here, Adams had taken 7 states, 6 New England, 1 New York. Clay had taken 3. If you add Clay's 3 to Adams' 7, that makes 10, but that's still 3 short of 13. By the way, the Electoral College, to summarize it, Jackson had carried 11 states, Adams 7, Crawford and Clay 3 each. Some of the states were split, as you can see. Louisiana, for instance, didn't have a unit rule, neither did Illinois. I'm counting those states for the candidate who got the most electoral votes. So Adams gets his 7, Clay swings his 3, that makes 10. The last 3 to make 13 wound up being Illinois, Louisiana, and Maryland. Now, in all those 3 states, all 3 of them, in fact, had split their electoral vote. Adams had gotten at least 1 electoral vote in each of those 3 states, Illinois, Louisiana, and Maryland. But in all 3, Jackson had gotten the most. Now, Maryland's a very peculiar case. Jackson got most of the state's electoral votes, even though Adams won the popular vote. So you could say that if congressmen from Maryland were simply going to follow the will of the people, they would go not with the electoral vote, but with the popular vote and go for Adams. The other 5 states were another matter. In Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri, Clay had run first. Adams didn't run second. Jackson ran second. And Illinois, he had run first. These states would go for Adams in the House. Louisiana didn't have a popular vote. These are the states, in fact, that made Adams president. Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, Maryland, Louisiana. Now you notice one that's missing here, and that's the one I started out with, New York. Adams did get its vote in the House of Representatives, but that hardly needs explaining. He had gotten 26 out of its 38 electoral votes also. Martin Van Buren's memory to the contrary, Andrew Jackson had no reason to expect to carry New York. He was not popular there, particularly. Didn't have much of an organization. It's true that New York had no popular vote, so we can't tell really what the people wanted, but that wasn't Adams's fault. That was, if anybody's, it was Van Buren's. Van Buren was a Crawford man. The Crawford people in New York, as in many other states, controlled the party apparatus. And the Crawford men, Van Buren and his lieutenants, because Van Buren ran the New York party machine, had refused the cry for a popular vote there precisely because they knew Crawford couldn't win it. They'd rather have the legislature cast the electoral votes. So in the end, John Quincy Adams was made president by a literal handful of Western congressmen. In some of these states, we're talking about one guy. Illinois only had one congressman, Daniel Cook, so he cast his vote. Missouri only had one congressman, John Scott. He cast his vote. Louisiana has 3 congressmen. 2 of them vote for Adams. There you go. And a majority of the congressional delegations from Ohio and Kentucky. Now, all these people were, in fact, Clay supporters. They all followed Clay's lead in preferring Adams to Jackson. But why would they do that? Question not often asked. Clay's own declared reason for choosing Adams over Jackson was simple. Like him or not, John Quincy Adams was an accomplished statesman, while Andrew Jackson was a maniac. He was a mere military chieftain, that's Clay's phrase, whose popularity combined with his authoritarian personality made him a threat to the Republic. Now, however self-interested this opinion of Clay's was, there's very good evidence up to this point to show that he was dead right. He wasn't the only person who thought this. Jackson's military and private history was indeed littered with episodes of gross insubordination to his superiors, up to the point, at one point, of issuing an order throughout his army command telling them all that they were to ignore orders from the President of the United States. He had challenged Winfield Scott to a duel. He was a loose cannon. Gross insubordination to civil authority and also savage violence, both as a general and in his private life, against everybody who crossed him. He had fought duels and street brawls and killed a man in a duel, summarily executed enemy captives and people who just happened to be in his way, and also summarily executed what he felt like his own soldiers. He was armed and dangerous. Clay was not the only person who thought he might be mentally unbalanced. Later on, Jackson became president and more or less did not act crazy. There are some historians who would say that he did. But as a result, you look at Clay's warnings against Jackson, you say, oh, this is just exaggeration. Well, nobody knew that Jackson was going to settle down and behave more or less like a normal human being once he became president. He had on many occasions not done so far. And Americans were highly attuned to the fragility of popular government. History, both ancient and modern, furnished plentiful examples of republics brought down by a military man on a white horse, from Julius Caesar to, most recently, Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, before announcing his support for Adams, Clay met privately with him on January 9th. I mentioned this earlier, there's no doubt about it. There he divulged his pleasure for Adams, his preference. He said, I'm going to vote for you. But also, and Adams put this in his diary, and I'm quoting, Mr. Clay wished me, as far as I might think proper, to satisfy him with regard to some principles of great public importance. What might that have been? Did Adams really offer Clay the State Department in return for Clay making him president? It seems, I think, highly improbable. The historian George Dangerfield said that Adams would have thought such an offer sinful, and Clay would have regarded it as naive, and I think he's right on both counts. But the evidence, though it's only circumstantial, points strongly toward what they probably did discuss, and that is, from earlier, internal improvements. Remember that Clay had staked his fortunes on the fate of the American system. Now, the tariff would later become a much more explosive issue, but the tariff wasn't really at risk. Fine-tuning congressional tax policy, because tariff is a tax, was a peculiarly congressional prerogative. Presidents had, and they would, voice a general opinion: you ought to lower the tariff, you ought to raise the tariff, but they weren't going to get into the details of it and start vetoing bills. No president had vetoed a tariff, none would until 1842. Internal improvements were another matter. Early presidents, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, didn't veto many bills, but they had vetoed internal improvements. That's precisely what they had vetoed. They had, in fact, stopped the internal improvements policy dead in its tracks with vetoes. Now, Monroe, at the last minute, by 1824, had relented and signed this precedent-setting bill in 1824, but there was no guarantee that the president following him was going to keep up with that. Clay and Adams had never been friendly, either politically or personally. Not only did they have opposing personalities, but their home regions had traditionally opposed each other on every issue. Furthermore, and this would come back to haunt them, seeing each other as potential rivals, their agents, their minions, have been doing their best to blacken each other's character for some years. In particular, people who are known agents of Clay had been accusing Adams of hating the West, because after all, he's a Yankee Federalist, born such anyway, and as we know, all Yankee Federalists hate the West. And yet, if Clay, in that private meeting with Adams, had said something along the lines of, I'm leaning your way in the House of Representatives, but will you favor internal improvements? He would have received from Adams an immediate and heartfelt yes. Though Adams hadn't made it public yet, in fact, there was no policy that Adams treasured more. Privately, for years, he had admired Clay's championship of internal improvements. It's the only thing about Clay that he did admire. For all their differences, the two men shared an identical vision of national greatness brought forth by the fostering hand of a wise and benevolent federal government. So the bargain they made, and I think there probably was a bargain, they said there was a bargain. It wasn't about office. It was to pin both their political futures, and as they saw it, the fate of the country, on furthering the American system. And in fact, promoting the system became the hallmark of Adams's presidency. As he later said, these are his own words, the great effort of my administration was to mature into a permanent and regular system the application of all the superfluous revenue of the Union to internal improvement. And this, not his own personal advancement, was exactly the grounds on which Clay could go to congressmen from those key states along the middle of the country and ask them to vote for Adams. Those 6 states I mentioned earlier were nearly crazy for internal improvement. On the landmark, precedent-setting, floodgate opening internal improvement bill that passed Congress in 1824, and these are the same congressmen who were going to vote on the presidential election a few months later, the congressmen from those 6 states voted 36 in favor, none against. 36-0. In the Senate, the vote was 11-0 in those states. And without that majority, the bill doesn't pass. So did Adams and Clay make a bargain on their own testimony? Yes. Was it in any way corrupt? No reason to think so. As for Adams's part of it, his purported part of it, appointing Clay Secretary of State, there's really nothing to explain. Clay was, by dint of experience, inclination, and reputation, the obvious man to be Secretary of State. In fact, it was so obvious that one has to admire the Jacksonian skill in discrediting this appointment by forecasting that it was going to be made. You charge that there's a bargain for Adams to make Clay Secretary of State, and then when he does it, it does the obvious thing. It looks corrupt because you predicted that he did it. This is a real early example of spin. You turn an obvious and otherwise, almost inevitable thing into evidence of corruption just by saying it's going to happen. It would have been remarkable if Adams had not appointed Clay Secretary of State. Clay had been a candidate for Secretary of State back on Monroe. And yet Jackson's outrage was doubtlessly real, whether or not misplaced. Remember his phrase. He didn't call Clay a Judas, he called him the Judas of the West. Jackson thought he was entitled to the presidency as the people's choice. As we saw, that's half true. It's a substantive claim, not a slam dunk. He had won a 42% popularity in the popular vote. It's not a majority, but it's more than anybody else. Further, if you count the states that he carried in the general election, and then count the 3 western ones where he ran second to Henry Clay, that puts him over the top right there. And as for promoting Western interests, if Clay wants to promote Western interests, why is he talking to Adams? Jackson had been every bit as much of an advocate of those interests as Clay had. Well, this brings us to one of the many ironies which this election is layered with. One of these ironies is certainly that Henry Clay had, as we've seen, to spend the rest of his life defending himself against a charge of venality and corruption for what he had good reason to regard as the most courageous and statesmanlike act he ever committed. He did the right thing, as he thought, in supporting Adams. Jackson's capitalized splendidly on what they charged was an alliance, in fact, so unnatural that only corruption could explain it. The alliance of Adams and Clay, Massachusetts and Kentucky, New England and the West. The coalition, and now I am quoting Congressman John Randolph, a famous phrase, the coalition unheard of till then of Bliffle and Black George, of the Puritan with the black leg. This characters, Bliffle and Black George, are from Tom Jones. Bliffle is a sanctimonious, hypocritical Puritan, John Quincy Adams. Black George he's a rogue, he's a black leg, Henry Clay. Well, forgotten in all this is the other coalition that came out of the election, the coalition that in 1828 brought down Adams and Clay and became the core of Jackson's Democratic Party, the coalition that made Martin Van Buren Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State, Vice President, and hand-picked successor. That coalition, formed almost immediately in response to Adams' election, was the coalition of Jackson and Crawford. An alliance that right up to the election looked every bit as impossible as the coalition of Adams and Clay. Politics, as we know, makes strange bedfellows. At first, Jackson and Crawford had absolutely nothing in common with each other than that they had lost the election and they weren't happy about it. And they blamed it on Adams and Clay. That frustration and desire to beat them next time, along with Jackson's undoubted personal popularity, was enough to get Jackson elected president in 1828. It wasn't enough to govern on. Once Jackson was elected in 1828, he had to decide what to do. He had to decide what to do in particular about the American system. Everything in Jackson's record down to 1824 said that he would champion it. But the fallout from 1824 worked a momentous change in Jackson's view of the world. His outrage at the Adams and Clay alliance soured him on the policies that alliance was formed to promote. Jackson, like Clay, had once seen the tariff and internal improvements as a great nationalizing program. He now saw them, after 1824, as only loaves and fishes, the sordid fruits of bargain and corruption, the spoils of what he called flagitious log-rolling legislation. These two guys get in the White House, and then they deal out the favors to their supporters in the form of the tariff internal improvements. And so, over the course of his first term as president, Jackson turned decisively against the American system, against the very policies he had run on in 1824. And as he did so, men who had supported him in 1824, original Jacksonians, found themselves thrown out of his party and replaced by who? Crawfordites, the people whom they had hated above all. The Democratic Party, as it emerged from Jackson's presidency, was stamped with his personal style, but in terms of its program, its political philosophy, it didn't come from him in 1824, it came from the forgotten man, William Harris Crawford. Now, in retrospect, and I am closing, finally, in retrospect, Jackson's reversal came to have the appearance of inevitability. In fact, it didn't look like a reversal at all. Jackson came to believe that, of course, and Democrats came to believe that, of course, Jackson was going to go back to the old policies of Jefferson and Madison, of strict construction, of minimal federal government. Seemed to return to the normal order of things. And in fact, Jackson managed to convince himself that not only his reversal was a return to the normal order of things, that he had been elected to reverse his policies, and in fact that he hadn't reversed them. That he'd always been an old-fashioned Jeffersonian. All one can say is that there was nothing on February 8, 1825, the day before the House made Adams president, there was nothing to predict that Andrew Jackson would change his political stripes so completely. So, what happens, we were asked as a prompt to this, what happens if the election comes out differently? What happens if Adams gets to the White House another way, let's say by a bargain with Jackson instead of with Clay? Or what happens if Jackson gets there by a bargain with, most likely with Adams instead of Clay? Adams doesn't get elected in 1824, maybe Jackson does. If he does get elected in 24, he comes into office, but he doesn't come into office angry. He doesn't come into office to throw out the corruptions. He comes into office on completely different terms and in a completely different frame of mind. And he does not attack the tariff and internal improvements, and he does not repudiate the American system, and he does not found the Democratic Party. And in short, what happens if 1824 goes a different way? How is the rest of American history different? How much is different? Everything. Thank you. Believe me, I've drastically simplified that in order to get it into 55 minutes. I would love some questions. Yes, sir.
I know that Adams had a very unsuccessful presidency. Could you talk about how, I don't know if Jackson and others conspired to make his life miserable, or it just happened to let them?
Why was Adams' presidency unsuccessful? Was it because Jackson and others conspired to ruin it? And the answer to that, this is a good question because it gets a simple answer, yes. The Jacksonians, including Jackson's newspaper editor, Duff Green of the United States Telegraph, the way they maligned the Adams administration, misrepresented it, was just astonishing. Historians really, I think, have not fully appreciated how scurrilous the Jacksonians were. Adams was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. I'll give you one example. The Jacksonians raked Adams over the coals for not divulging in public some private diplomatic communications within the administration leading up to something called the Panama Congress, which was supposed to be a kind of pan-American meeting of the newly independent American states, including Latin American states. Panama Congress itself is complicated. But there was some correspondence about this, some letters written back and forth and some memoranda that Adams, this is private diplomatic stuff, executive privilege, that Adams didn't want to give to Congress, didn't want shown in public, and the Jacksonians just raked him over the coals. What have you got to hide? You know, secret diplomacy, blah, blah, blah. Finally, and I'm sure with great relish, on almost literally the last day of his administration, Adams sent a message to the Senate saying, okay, you want to see this stuff? Here it is. You look at it. Well, it included some frank comments by Henry Clay about European powers. Some not very flattering comments about European powers. And also some not very flattering comments about Simon Bolivar. This is exactly the kind of stuff that you don't want in the newspapers. But the Jacksonian newspapers have been clamoring for it, so Adams says, okay, you want it, here it is. And the next day, the United States Telegraph runs an editorial saying that the Adams administration has deliberately made this stuff public in order to sabotage the diplomacy of the incoming Jackson administration by embarrassing the United States with foreign governments. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you keep the stuff private, you're hiding it. If you make it public, you're trying to ruin things. Adams was the victim of 4 years of Jacksonian hatchet jobs. Yes, Mike?
Dan, I want to ask you the question that you asked Roger about the 1800 election. Aren't you minimizing the sectional dimension of this election? You sort of left out the Missouri crisis and the fact that Adams is the only non-slave in this election.
I'm certainly not, I hope, underplaying the sectionalism, though I am emphasizing a different sectionalism, which is East-West sectionalism. And the reason I'm doing that is that, and I am not one generally to underplay the issue of slavery. I'll accuse you of that, but that's another matter. that's a different discussion. I'll retract that remark. I'm certainly not one to underplay slavery as a portentous issue, even when it's not being openly discussed.
Well,
but it doesn't play out in 1824. Sectionalism is vitally important, or regionalism, if you want to call it that, in 1824, but it just doesn't follow free state, slave state lines. It follows instead political economy lines. The vital element of sectionalism here is the East-West thing. And this is why the Jacksonians why the charge of corrupt bargain carries such credibility. The idea that Clay, the champion of the West, remember Jackson's Judas of the West, would make a deal with New England. And if you look at Western congressmen, for that matter Western voters, they regard their sectional enemies as the whole East. The cotton planting New England, they throw those two together because those eastern regions oppose Western issues. If you look at the votes in Congress in 1824, remember this is the same Congress that's going to elect Adams. Look at the tariff. Now, the tariff later became very closely associated with slavery. Never identical with, but closely associated with, so that Southern congressmen can get up and say, the South opposes the tariff. And for the most part, they're right. Remember those states that I said voted unanimously for the Internal Improvement Bill? They also voted unanimously for a tariff that passed in 1824. What are those states? Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. On matters of political economy, on the American system, Kentucky and Missouri are not voting versus Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They're a solid unitary block of Western states.
I think you're minimizing, though, and you're running out of time here, why a lot of Northerners really dislike Henry Clay because he arranged the Missouri Compromise.
Well,
Which
no,
was a sellout to the South.
that I would not at all question, but what influence was that have in the election? Are you saying that's why Clay
how many votes is Clay getting in Pennsylvania or New York? Zip.
Well, Jackson slammed everybody in Pennsylvania. I mean, when you beat three opponents by 3-1, not liking Henry Clay doesn't explain why Jackson also beats Adams and beats Crawford and again beats all three of them together.
In 1828, you might have mentioned it, and I don't remember. Was New England and New York just as loyal to John Quincy Adams?
No, Adams didn't carry New York in 1828. He was competitive here, but he didn't carry it. There is, I think, however, good reason to think that Adams would have carried New York in 1824 in a popular election, where the party apparatus was Crawford, and that's Van Buren, and again, Crawford just wasn't that popular in New York.
But we've got some high school students here, so for the benefit of the high school students in particular, you talk a little bit about what's at stake with internal improvements and what are the ideological underpinnings of the debate, the Jeffersonians being opposed and the next generation being in favor of. What's going on there? What's really at stake, and what are the ideological underpinnings of the debate?
Well, there are several, but I'll take it one direction, and then if that's not the direction you want, I'm happy to tell. I'm a kept man. I'm happy to. There had been a debate going back to the Federalists and the Jeffersonians about what role the federal government was to play generally in the life of the nation and the life of its people. And Adams and Clay, as I said, shared a vision. It's not really a federalist vision, because it's not an elitist vision, it's not an aristocratic vision. As they saw it, it was a vision of a republic, a free country, reaching its genuine full potential by using the people's power to promote the people's welfare. Adams laid this out in his first annual message to Congress, where he kind of flung down the gauntlet. And he said, liberty is power. Because we are a free country, we are empowered to do these things. The countries of Europe are vaulting ahead in the race of progress. Industrial progress, economic progress, moral progress, cultural progress. Here, those countries, they do things because the king tells them to. Here, we have all the people empowered to promote progress. It's going to be a humiliation for us if, given that we don't seize the advantages of this huge underpopulated country waiting to be exploited with all of its resources, to vault ahead of the rest of the world in the march of improvement. The United States should lead the world in progress toward everything good. And in fact, Adams, being a religious man of a certain sort, thought that this opportunity, and many Americans agreed with him, was providential. That this can't just be accident. That you've got this whole open country with all these resources and a government that for the first time in human history is based upon correct principles together. God has set us here at this time to fulfill the highest destiny that human beings can reach of their own power. That's the Adams and Clay vision. And internal improvements and tariff are a practical part of that. They're also, of course, a practical policy. You get yours, I get mine. The Jacksonian vision, which goes back to the Democratic Republican vision, the Jeffersonian vision, becomes, and I say becomes because everything I just said, I think Andrew Jackson would have agreed with entirely in 1824. But by 28, Jackson's convinced, as I said, that the tariff internal improvements are really just a way of buying votes. And Jackson goes back to the Jeffersonian view, which is the best thing a government of a free people can do for them is to leave them as free as possible. And to interfere in their lives as little as possible, to control their lives as little as possible, direct their lives as little as possible. Is that what you were going for?
Just follow up. You're talking, when you talk about internal improvements, just so that you understand, you're talking about canals?
I'm talking about roads and canals.
Make commerce flow more easily?
Yes.
That's what you're talking about.
And the assumption at the time, which would later be outdated, internal improvements have a long history after this, but they had a certain urgency at this time, especially since the Panic of 1819. The country was coming out of a depression in the early 1820s. The assumption was that what the country really needed were bold national works, extending long distances, crossing state boundaries, and that states aren't going to undertake them, sometimes because states aren't the beneficiaries. If you have a crucial road that starts here and goes there, but I'm the state in the middle, what do I care? And the assumption was that the states couldn't or wouldn't build these great works on their own, and that there wasn't private capital in the country to do it. And so if the country's economy is going to become integrated, if you're going to have a decent national transportation system, the federal government's going to have to run it. Or not, run it is too strong. Orchestrate it and pay for it.
The railroads were not a federal thing. The landways were given to the railroad companies, and this is about the time railroads were coming in.
No, not yet, not yet. The first itsy-bitsy little experimental railroads were built in the 1830s. The big railroad boom starts in the 1840s. Nobody's talking railroads yet in the 1820s. They're talking roads, and in fact the federal government had sponsored one road, the so-called Cumberland Road or National Road, from western Maryland through the capitals of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And we're also talking canals, and the great landmark here that everybody was looking to was the Erie Canal, which hadn't been finished quite yet, but was clearly going to be finished, which was built by New York State.
You talked about Jackson turning from internal improvements in 1928 was elected. What were the long-term consequences of that? How long Jackson turned against internal improvements. How long did that last, and what effect did that have on the development of internal improvements over the next 20, 30 years?
Well, politically, opposition to internal improvements became a standing plank of the Democratic Party all the way through up to the Civil War. I mean, James K. Polk is still vetoing bills in the 1840s. Now, the reason he had to veto bills is that Western Democrats on internal improvement issues tended to vote for them as Westerners, despite being Democrats. But leaving aside, what congressmen had to do to keep the folks at home happy, opposition to internal improvements became a standing plank of the Democratic Party. And support for them became a standing plank of the Whig Party. And you can see some lineage of this even after the Civil War with the railroads. Though it gets fuzzy, it's not really strictly a party issue. In terms of the economic effect, while the tariff and internal improvements remain as kind of hot-button political issues, at least through the 1830s and 40s, when they get to be supplanted by slavery, they don't really have the urgency after the 1820s, because after the 1820s it becomes increasingly important that roads and canals are going to get built whether the federal government builds them or not. Thank you.